Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Seigo. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us save our peoples and the planet. When the protests broke out all over Canada and the United States against police anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and brutality, the media started asking the question, is there racism in Canada? Hello? Genocide? It's only been a year since Canada was found guilty of historic and ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. How can we be asking if systemic racism exists? We should be asking what to do about it. So stay tuned to hear more about our plan to combat racism in Canada. Welcome back to the third video in my learning series on combating racism in Canada. Through these videos, we'll not only look at different aspects of individual and systemic racism, but we'll also craft a plan on how to address it. So make sure you hit both the subscribe button and the bell so that you're notified as soon as I upload a video. Today I want to talk about one of the most destructive forms of systemic racism, genocide. It was only last year that the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of both historic and ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. But they also found that Canada specifically targeted Indigenous women and girls in unique ways, in a form of gendered colonization that is the root cause of the high rates of violence, exploitations, disappearances, and murders of Indigenous women and girls today. Genocide is the worst crime that can be committed against a people. And while it can be committed against a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, in Canada's case, it targeted what it perceived to be a racial group of Indians for elimination and assimilation. While people in society use genocide for a whole range of actions, many of them are not in fact genocide. It's important to note that while systemic racism can be part of the crime of genocide, not all forms of systemic racism are genocide. Generally speaking, systemic racism is a form of racism that is deeply ingrained in various institutions like government, businesses, organizations, and society. And it often leads to discrimination or unfair treatment of a group of people. Think about systemic racism in Canada's employment system and practices. Indigenous people suffer higher rates of unemployment, and for those who are employed, they make less income than white people. They also experience higher rates of discrimination when applying for jobs and once they get the job. Let's use universities as an example. The Canadian Association of University Teachers conducted research that shows that Indigenous academics are still grossly underrepresented in universities, and they make 26% less than their white colleagues. And how many university presidents do you know who are First Nations? So, we can see in this example that the racism experienced by Indigenous academics in universities are not just a few isolated incidents, but it's widespread, it's systemic, and has real economic consequences on Indigenous peoples, and this needs to be remedied. However, this kind of discrimination in the workplace that results from systemic racism is different from the crime of genocide. Genocide requires two things. One, a mental element, an intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a racial group, for example. Number two, it requires a physical element. That means committing one of 5 specific acts: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring the children of that group to another group. Now, genocide can take place during conflicts, but also during peaceful times. It can happen in a relatively short period of time or over a longer period. And there's no minimum number of deaths or set of harms required to qualify as a genocide. The Holocaust is one of the worst examples of genocide, but it's not the standard. Genocide can happen in different times, in different ways, and in different political contexts. Polish Jewish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin's work was instrumental in understanding genocide, and that it does not require the destruction of the whole group, something that most people really misunderstand. I get asked quite often, well, you're still here, so it couldn't have been genocide. And that's a misunderstanding of the law. Lemkin explained, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended, rather, to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of the national group with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Here in Canada, the National Inquiry found that race-based genocide against Indigenous peoples has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60s Scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human and Inuit, Métis, and First Nation rights, leading directly to the current rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. Genocide is the root cause of violence against Indigenous women and girls historically and currently, because of the genocidal acts perpetrated against them and because of the socioeconomic conditions which create vulnerabilities for Indigenous women and girls. In order to prove genocide in our context, there must be an intent to physically destroy, in whole or in part, the racial group of Indigenous peoples. Now, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls considered the testimonies and submissions of over 2,000 survivors, family members, leaders, and subject matter experts. They conducted their own legal analysis of genocide and all of the elements to determine whether Canada's actions met the legal standard. They concluded that Canada had committed race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples that especially targeted Indigenous women and girls in very gendered ways. And I quote, "Canada has displayed a continuous policy with shifting express motives, but an ultimately steady intention to destroy Indigenous peoples physically, biologically, and as social units, thereby fulfilling the required specific intent element." There is no doubt that Canada aimed to eliminate Indigenous nations. Some historical examples were biological warfare, like smallpox blankets, scalping bounties, murders, ethnic cleansing and starvation policies, and the deaths in residential schools. I quote, "Canada's colonial history provides ample evidence of the existence of a genocidal policy, a manifest pattern of similar conduct which reflects an intention to destroy Indigenous peoples." Today's examples would be the high rate of child apprehensions, forced sterilizations, lack of police protection, Indian Act extinction legislation, and the maintenance of the status quo, which allows violence and death of Indigenous women and girls to continue. Equally important is not just what Canada did or does now, but what it omits to do. It fails to protect Indigenous peoples from harm, ensure their safety, and equal access to essential social services like food, water, housing, education, and healthcare. The denial of all of these things has led to the violence and death of Indigenous women and girls. Race-based genocide is the worst form of racism there is. And for Indigenous women and girls, they're dually disadvantaged because of racism and sexism. So what's the solution? It's to stop it. Stop the race-based genocide and sexualized violence against Indigenous peoples. The National Inquiry concluded that Canada has a legal obligation of cessation to stop the pattern of violence and oppression of Indigenous peoples and provide reparations for what it's done. Now, the National Inquiry offered many individual recommendations on specific issues within their report. But ultimately, they called for a national action plan to end genocide urgently. And this is consistent with what many of us have advocated for as well. A transitional justice plan that's national in scope, that commits all levels of government, is informed and directed by Indigenous women, is overseen by independent international genocide experts from the UN, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, or both, and is empowered with sufficient resources at the level required to urgently end genocide on a national level. It's been a year since the National Inquiry called on Canada to implement a national action plan, and they failed to do so, despite concerns being raised by the Organization of American States and the United Nations. As a result, Indigenous women and girls continue to lose their lives. We can't possibly combat systemic racism in Canada without first confronting the race-based genocide against Indigenous peoples. It's time for all Canadians to rise up and push their governments to end the senseless violence and loss of life. This shouldn't be a country that represents genocide. It should be a country that represents the spirit of the treaties, peace and cooperation. Thank you for watching my channel. I really hope that you join me on this mission to educate Canadians and lay out the foundations of an action plan to end racism in Canada. And I'll be sure to post links to the report of the National Inquiry and its specific report on genocide, as well as the UN Convention on Genocide. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing, commenting, and sharing these videos with your family, colleagues, friends, and social justice allies. If you want additional resources, you can check out my website at www.pampalmater.com. Thank you all for your continued support and ongoing feedback. I hope you'll join me for the next video in my Combating Racism in Canada series. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.